Our first article today is by Susan Stryker, titled Transgender History, Homonormativity, and Disciplinarity. So let's start off with a question. If I were to say, what is the birth of the gay liberation movement? What image or place comes to your mind? Stonewall, thank you. For anybody who knows anything about this subject, it's Stonewall, the famous Stonewall uprising in New York in 1969. And one of the key questions in this chapter is, why does everyone know about Stonewall, but not what happens at Compton's Cafeteria? Her answer is that Compton's Cafeteria had a much more, although these things have also been erased apparently from the Stonewall story, had a much more transgender component. It was actually 3 years earlier than Stonewall, so you can't say it was Stonewall was first. In fact, the Compton's Cafeteria was first. It was much more multi-ethnic, multiracial, much more working class, and it had sex workers too. And so what she's saying is that, as the queer activists have said, is that there's this whole mythologizing of Stonewall as the place. The birth of gay liberation is a homonormative cooptation. It is certainly also true that because Stonewall then becomes more associated with white upper-class male homosexuality, which was more palatable, right? It's more palatable for people in the United States to be like, that's the place. So absolutely, in some ways, what Stryker is saying here is that what happened at Compton's Cafeteria in California has basically been erased or doesn't count because it's subsumed under this homonormative cooptation of this wider movement, which, as Stryker believes, should be more than that. And her subpoint to this is, as you read along in the article, is that even Stryker's own efforts to put this out there as an academic, to get this into the official history, seem not to count, in part because what happens is a person who looks like Stryker is said to be too subjective, doesn't know what's going on. And because, in fact, they are participating in the activism, they're said, oh, you can't approach it from a so-called objective perspective. So there are a lot of parallels into how these official events, right, these kinds of ideas that it was the official celebration of certain types of people and certain kinds of resistance, then becomes memorialized. Whereas others, which may have been more radical or weren't the right people, right, weren't palatable people, people that seem good, get counted out of history and out of academic work. So it's actually a pretty fascinating article to start with. Our second article is Jafari Allen's Erotic Subjectivity in Cuba, and also pretty fascinating too, in part because he's talking about something that he calls color drag. And by color drag, talks about this transformation as Octavio changes from being a man to a woman. It is also goes from being Negro to mulatta. To say this whole whitening or blanqueamiento of features so that the person can look more like mestiza, you might say, than the darker skin tone. And of course, this is also about gender and sexuality in Cuba, which has some pretty different ideas. That it's not necessarily what we might consider homophobia. It's more that Octavio is a failed version of Cuban masculinity. So it's misogyny more than homophobia. And it's also a whole different definition of what it means to be gay or homosexual. As throughout much of Latin America is the idea that you could be a totally heterosexual guy as long as you're not the receiver, as long as you're, and so that wouldn't count as homosexuals. Homosexuals are only the ones who are the penetrated, let us say. So in this sense, since he would not be considered that, but because he goes into drag, then he is considered to be a homosexual, but it's more because of the misogyny piece here. So it's a pretty interesting article that plays with all of these ideas. We finally have, what did we learn about this San Francisco here? I want to start off with the demographics of San Francisco. When I say San Francisco, what image comes to mind? Golden Gate Bridge. They call it the blackest high school in the least black city in America. I didn't quite realize how San Francisco might be, because it has this whole progressive reputation, right? But as she puts it, it's the least black city in America, but here it's in the blackest high school. And she calls San Francisco the Homonationalist Capital of the United States, which was an interesting idea too. I was a genuine article that provided a glimmer of what a grown, queer, colored life could be like for kids who live in the homo-nationalist capital of the United States. My body, a counter geography to the white-on-white bourgeois men's space that the Castro has become. So as we were talking about homonormativity, in certain places of San Francisco, you have this white-on-white bourgeois homonormative space, which she's saying that she's a glimmer of what of a counter geography to that. She says that even in this high school that is trying to be progressive in a progressive place, she said it is still governed by the logics of anti-blackness and heteronormativity. So I took 3 lessons from these. Lesson 1, we should always be aware of heteronormativity. We know about that. So we should be aware of all the ways in which our society structures us to be heteronormative, but we also should be aware of homonormativity. Now, this is something that I would say far fewer people are aware of. So we may have in our minds what it means to be heteronormative, but homonormativity is not something that we may know about as much. Lesson 2 for me is primarily comes from the Jafari Allen's article, is to be aware of colorism. A lot of us are aware of racism, but colorism is not something that a lot of people necessarily talk about. And colorism is this preference for the whiter traits. It's talked about as blanqueamiento in parts of Latin America, of being mestizo, but on the way to whiteness. And so there's a preference for either trying to physically change yourself, applying different creams and skin and hair products, or marrying or having children that are becoming whiter, and that these are privileged. And colorism is ideas that are in Latin America and communities that we might consider as Latino, Latina, or even within African American or Black communities, a preference for people who look lighter skinned. And so if we look at the people who are often successful even in US life, they often tend to be on the lighter side of the spectrum. And I just want to point out that oftentimes white people don't know necessarily that they are engaging in colorism practices. Sometimes you need a psychology test to figure this out. For example, they give people two pictures, say, of a light-skinned Black man and a dark-skinned Black man, and then they'll describe the same crime that this person has supposedly committed, and people will tend to want to impose a harsher sentence on the darker-skinned Black man for the same exact thing. And so it's something that in white people's own lives, they're often actually doing this colorism thing. They may not realize, they might think that this is just a race thing, but it happens within Black and white and Latin communities as well. So it's just something to keep in mind, because oftentimes we talk about racism, but we don't understand that racism is more, it tends to be more like an anti-Blackness, and that Blackness is at the bottom of our hierarchy or ladder of scale. Lesson 3, to just be aware that there's often this preference for masculine traits, even in places that are these spaces where it's either all women or LGBTQ spaces, that sometimes this can still be a thing where people are prioritizing the traits that are seen as more masculine. Again, none of these things is necessarily, I'm not saying that they are, that they're automatically going to exist in these places, but it's just something to think about as you are navigating your world, to think about the ways in which these ideas and overall structures shape our interactions with other people. My big 3 lessons for today